from. This is Kim Stevens with Advocates for Families First, which is a program of North American Council on Adoptable Children, Generations United, and the National Foster Parent Association. We are an alliance that is working to help ensure that kids who cannot live at home with their birth mom or dad are able to live in family-based care, and that we have policies and practices that support those caregivers, whether they are kinship caregivers, adoptive caregivers, or foster caregivers. Today we are very excited to welcome you to our broadcast about the Behavioral Interventionist program. And as you read when you registered, and as you will hear throughout the presentation, this is a brand new model. Well, not brand new, it's been around for a few years, but a very exciting model that works to keep kids with very serious challenges in family where they receive treatment, residential-based treatment level care within their family. So meeting their behavioral needs at the same time as we are meeting their relationship needs, and that is crucial to the success of our kids and our families, I think. Our presenters are three very impressive folks. Lori Ross is the president, CEO, and co-founder of the Midwest Foster Care and Adoption Association, which is located in Kansas City, Missouri, or just outside. It is a support and advocacy organization for foster and adoptive families. She herself has been a foster adoptive parent since 1985 with her husband and has cared for more than 400 children. She has served as a teaching foster parent for 28 years and is the author of the recently published book, Don't Sweat the Small Stuff, Advice from the Trenches for Foster and Adoptive Parents. Our second presenter is Tim Decker, who is the director of the Missouri Division of Children's Services. For 30 years, he served with the Missouri Department of Social Services and the Greater Kansas City Local Investment Commission, or LINC. That is one of Missouri's innovative public-private community partnerships focused on citizen engagement, local governance, natural helping networks, and neighborhood-based services. He speaks nationally on juvenile justice reform, leadership and professional development, organizational culture change, and results-based accountability. Tim now serves as a member of the Policy Fellows Network and is an instructor in the Youth in Custody and Multi-System Integration Certification programs. And last but certainly not least, Susan Peach, who is a licensed certified social worker, provides in-home family-centered clinical services through LifeWorks Family Treatment Group in Kansas City. She has piloted and used the in-home behavioral interventionist program since 2014. Susan has extensive training and experience in bonding, attachment, and trauma-informed care, and is committed to working with families formed through adoption, and recognizes that that family is the key to healing for children. And Lori, if you can go to the second slide, I'd just like to, there you go. So just folks, if you're on, you can see the slides right there on your computer. You can either listen through your computer speakers or use the audio portion, and you'll see down at the control panel, if you're having trouble with the microphone and speakers on your computer, you can always use the telephone instead. Once you click on that use telephone and switch out, you'll get a PIN number to call in. All of you will be muted throughout the presentation so that there won't be any background noise. And because this is such a really deep and long presentation, we're going to hold questions till the end. But please type them as you think of them in the question box. I will be keeping track of the questions and monitoring them to make sure that we don't lose any. I've got Notepad right here next to me. The other thing I want to advise you of is that the webinar will go for about an hour and 15 minutes. So we're going to go a little bit late. And finally, if you have a colleague who has not been able to sign in, we have well over 100 folks that have registered. I think we have about 185 that registered. Our platform can handle 100. This webinar will be recorded and archived. All of the presentation will be available to people after the fact, so don't worry about it. You will certainly be able to get to it. And with that, I am going to turn it over to our presenters. Lori, are you speaking? Because we can't hear you.
I think Lori's going to have to dial back in, and she's working on that right now.
Perfect. Thank you, Becky. I know we have a couple folks that just logged in. Don't worry, we just have a little audio issue that is being corrected, and we will begin shortly.
Can you hear me now?
We sure can. Great.
There you go. Love this technology. Okay, so I apologize for that little delay, and I know you've all now had time to read the stats that are sitting here on your website. And basically what this says is that we know that there are lots of youth who are in residential treatment in the United States, and that we spend a lot of money to put kids in residential treatment, and that we also have figured out over time that we're getting really limited results from that investment, that our kids are not getting significantly better, and that our kids obviously are doing better if they are in families. But what we know is that we're not putting kids in residential treatment just because of the fact that we can't find family placement options for them. Oftentimes, kids are in residential treatment because families have discovered that they have an inability to keep those kids safe, or to keep the rest of their family safe, or be able to function as families based on the incredibly difficult needs that kids who've suffered substantial trauma and have perhaps some physiological mental health issues may have. And so our findings that we see here, the studies that we've got listed on this slide, really address those issues. There's limited evidence that supports the use of keeping kids in residential treatment, but when we have kids who have significant needs, that's what our systems of child welfare have resorted to, because it's hard to get them in families when they have that significant of needs. So what we know about adoptive and foster families in general is that adoptive families are more likely to seek counseling for their children, more likely to seek residential treatment for their children than our birth families. And really, like the study says, some of this may be about the fact that foster adoptive families have received a lot of training, and they recognize that there is help available and they're more likely to seek help. But we also know that children who have suffered the trauma of abuse and neglect in the first place and been removed from their homes are going to be more likely to have significant behavioral and mental health issues than the general population. You guys don't want me to read this to you, I'm quite sure, so I won't. So what we know is from the Great Donaldson study is that these kids' behavioral issues can create post-adoption instability. The Keeping the Promise study by the Donaldson Institute really showed that that we have a lot of kids who re-enter care at some point as a result of the issues related to being able to care for them within the context of the adoptive family. We have a lot of states that that won't be able to provide residential treatment for adoptive children because of their funding structures or their philosophy related to that. And even in the states where adoption subsidy will provide for residential treatment for kids, very often a residential treatment placement is what adoptive families feel like is kind of a last resort, and by the time kids go into those placements, we sometimes see adoptive families struggling to maintain their commitment I've also personally experienced that it's very difficult for residential treatment facilities to effectively engage with adoptive families or foster families while children are in treatment in those facilities. So we do see that when kids go into residential treatment, oftentimes adoptions become less stable, and that really what we need to be able to do is to provide more care to those kids in their homes. So a little bit about me. Kim told you a little bit. I've been a foster adoptive mom since 1985. I've fostered more than 400 children over the years, and my husband and I have adopted 23 children from the foster care system, 2 as adults, the rest while they were children, several as teens. Our children have a wide variety of different backgrounds that brought them into child welfare and different issues that we deal with as they go through their lives. Probably the most significant issues that I've dealt with have involved a sibling group of 8 children, and I'll be touching on one of those siblings as I move through the presentation. So I also began working with Midwest Foster Care and Adoption Association in its inception when it was a tiny little foster parent support group in 1998. The agency we incorporated in 2000, wrote a 501c3 at my kitchen table, and became a nonprofit agency in 2000 with the goal of providing post-adoptive and support services to foster and adoptive families in the Kansas City metro area. Since that time, we have grown from an all-volunteer group of parents to a nonprofit agency. We have about 80 employees and a 7-figure budget, and we provide a variety of services, including serving as one of the post-adoptive resource centers for the state of Missouri and providing really great child-specific recruitment services in the Kansas City area and in southwest Missouri. We also license foster homes in the 30-county northwest area of the state of Missouri. And what we really feel like we pride ourselves on is that we specialize in creating, piloting, and then disseminating strategies to address the needs of foster and adoptive children and the families caring for them. We always come from a perspective, and many of the staff members in my agency have served as foster adoptive parents or are adopted people, people who have spent time in foster care, and many others have worked in other aspects of the child welfare system as house parents in group homes or working with other departments. The Division of Youth Services here in Missouri has given me a couple of great staff members. So they all come to it with a real passion for the needs of kids and families. And when we're looking at a problem facing kids and families, we always start with, what would I need if I was in this boat? What would my family need? With the assumption that if we need it, then other people probably also need it as well. We also have a basic philosophy that if something is good for kids and families, then we're going to find a way to make that happen. We don't believe that it is an appropriate thing to say it can't be done for any barrier or obstruction that comes in the way. There is always a way to find a solution. So that's who we are, and that's where we come from. So I'm going to introduce you in this slide to my daughter, Cheyenne. Cheyenne came to my family. She's the third of a sibling group of 8. She came to my family when she was 13 months old. She had been brought into the foster care system at 8 months of age and had been living in a car at that time with her parents and 2 older siblings. Cheyenne had spent from 8 to 13 months moving through 6 different foster homes. Cheyenne was developmentally delayed, and she was an angry, sad baby. You probably could have easily, knowing what we know now, looked at her and said she had suffered significant trauma, and she probably met the criteria for reactive attachment disorder, before she was old enough to talk. So you see in these pictures, some pictures of Cheyenne. She is not looking like a real happy kid the majority of the time. The marks all over her are self-inflicted. She was doing self-injury when she was tiny. She would pick holes in her face or scratch herself and make marks. She would bite herself. She would do things in the midst of heinous, long fits on a regular basis. I believe that I reached out to my friend Susan Peach, who will be presenting later in this presentation, and said that I was way in over my head, and I would have never dreamed in a million years that a one-year-old baby could be the hardest kid I've ever met in my life, and she was and continued to be. So this is Cheyenne, and Cheyenne was my motivation for this program. Cheyenne was removed from her parents at 8 months of age. She had a difficult birth. What I learned was that her mother is a small person, and she had trouble with delivery. And so her mother got an idea in her head that Cheyenne had tried to kill her in the process of birth. And so while Cheyenne was in the hospital and Mom was still there, Mom didn't want to bring Cheyenne into the room with her or do any bonding with her. Cheyenne also was born after Mom had been reported to the newborn crisis assessment folks a couple of different times with the previously born siblings as a result of use of substances. And so the family was hiding from the child protection system from the get-go. Cheyenne had violent and extended tantrums, an inability to be soothed, inability to regulate herself. So in preschool, Cheyenne was given immediately an IEP for, I don't know, it was whatever they call the IEP for little kids, whatever the IEP is, that is the catch-all category. But by the time she got to kindergarten, they changed it to emotional disturbance. She went from the neighborhood school to the school that had the program for kids with emotional disturbances, and then by the time she was 7, she had her first residential stay. She spent 3 months at a local facility for an extended evaluation. She had several hospital stays, and Cheyenne didn't go to the hospital for your typical 5-day stay. Cheyenne's stay in hospitals, and we have several in the Kansas City area, and she visited several of them, was always 6 weeks or more. In one hospital stay, we had Cheyenne working with somebody who did genetic testing to try to find some medication that might work for her. We tried Clozaril with Cheyenne, but no medication or combination of medications was effective in reducing her aggressive acting out behaviors, her self-injurious behaviors, her constant need to seek attention in negative ways. When Cheyenne was 9, we made the decision that she couldn't safely live at home anymore. She broke a light bulb in her room and used it to cut herself, and at that point, we knew there was nothing more that we could do unless we could be awake 24 hours a day to keep her safe. So we looked at residential treatment facility. The only facility that would take her with her level of behaviors was 3.5 hours away from our home. It was a facility for older girls, and they ended up taking her placed at the highest level Missouri offers, a 4+, and they provided her with a one-on-one in that facility. At one point, we would go and visit her as often as we could, and it usually was no more than every 3 weeks that we could get away to go visit her. At that facility, during one visit, my husband and I went to pick her up for a visit, took her out of the facility, went to a McDonald's, and she was looking weird and woozy at the time. She always looked unkempt and not well cared for. But at that visit, we took her to McDonald's, and we went outside with lunch to sit down and eat, and she stood up and passed out and hit her head on the red box machine. Got back in the truck to go back to the facility because clearly something was wrong, and she threw up all over the back of my husband's truck. And I remember crying as I drove away from that facility after having left her there, thinking that my daughter might not be alive the next time I could come back and get her, but I couldn't bring her home because I couldn't keep her safe at home either. So I called the adoption subsidy worker on my way out of that visit and left a message saying I needed her out of that facility immediately, and I didn't know where we could find that would take her, but we had to find something else. We did find something else, placed her in a second facility in St. Louis, which is also about 3 hours from my home. She remained in that facility in a little bit better condition, but still not great, for more than a year, and absolutely had no improvement in functioning. There was not a lot of conversation with me when they were dealing with medication changes. There was not a lot of parent-family therapy or involvement. My husband and I would go and pick her up to take her out for visits as often as we could, but the most information we got about what was going on with her was from her at those visits. So I started to think about what I could do, and I remember signing an adoption subsidy contract update and looking at the amount of money that was getting spent on her residential care. And I remember thinking at the time, with the amount of money that was being spent on residential services for Cheyenne, and actually 2 of her siblings at that time had also joined her in that facility in St. Louis, looking at that amount of money and thinking, if I had that amount of money to work with, what could I do in my own home that would allow for Cheyenne and her siblings to be safe and well cared for at home with us? And so I thought about the questions I've got listed here. How can I keep them safe? How can I keep their other siblings safe? Because I can tell you that things in my house calmed down dramatically once Cheyenne and her other 2 siblings were in residential treatment. The level of crazy in our house, and that's a not very therapeutic word, but the level of crazy in our house diminished dramatically. And we were then able to work a lot more closely with their other siblings who were benefiting absolutely from not having the constant exposure to the adrenaline and the drama of nonstop escalation and the need to de-escalate one-on-one. How can I keep my house in one piece? I think probably a lot of you know that these children can be tremendously destructive to the actual physical house. Holes in walls, broken things everywhere, just very difficult. And what services would need to be in place to make all of that possible? And so then I thought, because I always think out of the box, can I create a program that would give my kids a better chance to develop into people who can live in the real world with some level of success? Because I know if they live in residential treatment until they're 18 years of age, they are not ever going to have any idea of how to function in the real world. They are not ever going to have any idea of how to interact with human beings and what people expect in relationships with each other. And if I can think of that, could I do that kind of a program within the dollars that are already being spent on the residential treatment programs that aren't working? And can I talk the Children's Division into funding it? So I wrote a letter to the Children's Division director at the time, and I basically said I was asking her to put her money where her mouth is. And that's not maybe the nicest words, but, you know, I had worked with a lot of Children's Division directors previously and heard them say that we don't want kids in residential treatment. And so what I was doing was I was challenging her to think outside of the box with me, and can we come up with a program that would allow children to safely live at home? And instead of using the money to pay residential treatment facilities, could we use the money to pay for an option that would keep kids at home? So I told her I needed one-on-one assistance in the home provided by an adult who was skilled in understanding the principles of trauma and emotional regulation. And I really was looking at that point, the work done by Bruce Perry and Dan Siegel on understanding what's going on in the brains of traumatized children and the need to offer unconventional therapies that can go into the parts of the brain that are impacted by trauma and begin to do some of the healing work there. And I knew that I needed that assistance during all the waking hours that my kids were not at school, because I work during the day and I have other children, and I actually do need to sleep at night, so I needed to have some assistance that would allow all of us to be able to continue the normal activities of daily living that allow our family to function and still provide my children with the supervision that they needed. I needed to have the people who were coming one-on-one into my home to be able to do activities of neural development, kind of based on Bruce Perry's work, so that not only were my children getting their homework done and brushing their teeth and taking their showers and not doing that in the midst of fighting with their siblings, but also they were engaging in activities that would stimulate some new neural pathways to develop, some new neural growth. So things that Bruce Perry talks about in terms of music and movement and motion and repetition and those things, and we'll talk about that a little bit more down the road. I needed them to be able to de-escalate my kids in crisis safely and keep them from being hurt and to keep my home from being destroyed. I do not want to spend the rest of my life replacing carpet and filling up holes in walls. I need them to learn how to live within the confines of a home instead of the concrete walls that they have in residential treatment facilities, and to figure out what to do with their anger and frustration that does not involve hurting themselves or someone else or tearing up my house. And I needed them to be able to participate in activities that normal children participate in, but my kids were unable and are unable to do those things in like teams. So I can't put them on the Blue Springs Basketball League and expect them to be able to function on a team, because they can't even walk through a room with their siblings without there being an issue. There's no way they can be on a team with a coach and do that. So I asked for assistance one-on-one for them to do activities of normal things for kids. And I wanted a safe timeout room built in my house where my kids could go when they were physically out of control so they wouldn't destroy things or hurt themselves. I'd seen safe timeout rooms in residential treatment facilities. I'd seen them in therapeutic day treatment schools, and I wanted to have one in my house. So that's what I asked for. About a year later, she finally responded and she said, well, we've thought about it and we can give you the one-on-one that you need, but we're not going to give you money for individualized activities and we're not going to build you a safe room. So I replied back and I said, deal, that's perfect. So I'll figure out the individualized activities, and hopefully the people that are working with the kids can figure out how to keep them safe without letting them hurt anyone else or themselves or tear up my house. So I found my friend Susan Peach, and I drafted a program document and wrote an application. We talked a little bit with the Children's Division about how to fund this and what funding stream might work, and Tim is going to talk a little bit later about the variety of funding streams. But the first one we found was Children's Treatment Service dollars. And Tim can tell you a little bit more about that, what that means. But we then drafted this document, and Susan agreed to have LifeWorks be the agency that would provide the service for me so that it could be used in my home with 3 of my children, with my daughter Cheyenne and her 2 siblings serving as the guinea pigs for the program. Susan submitted the program document and got approval as a CTS provider and started the process. And Cheyenne and her 2 siblings came home for a pass for Christmas in 2012, and I decided at that point I was not taking them back. So our services started in January of 2013. Based on the success of that program, LifeWorks then began to add other clients to the program, and eventually in March of this year, with the success of LifeWorks program and the demand for additional services growing, my agency, MFCAA, also implemented the program as a second service provider offering the program in the Kansas City area. And in June of this year, we met with Children's Division to explore other options for funding for this program with the goal of being able to serve a much larger number of kids who are currently in residential treatment in their homes and communities throughout Missouri. Our program manager for the BI program at MFCAA presented the program at our state conference for foster and adoptive families. Tim Decker was in the audience, our Children's Division director. And there is a huge amount of interest from foster adoptive families in Missouri to have access to this program to bring their children home from residential treatment. It has currently been used in homes that are adoptive homes with children as a post-adoptive support service. It's been used in foster homes as a support service for elevated needs level foster children when foster families are committed to keeping the kids but need that additional assistance so they don't end up in residential treatment. And it's been used, funded by community mental health services for families who have mentally ill children in the community, would like to be able to keep their children from needing to enter residential treatment through a very limited pool of local county-based mental health funds. So now I'm going to turn it over to Susan.
Well, I would like to say that when Lori contacted us, back around Christmas time in 2012 and said that her daughter and siblings were coming home on a pass and wanted to know if we would do something to help her with this program to provide those services in home, the same kind of services that Cheyenne and her other siblings could get in residential treatment. We were immediately on board. I had known Cheyenne since she was in foster care and knew of the challenges that she presented in any setting, quite frankly. And I talked to my business partner, Gray Indris, and we basically said, if we can be a part of doing whatever it takes to get children, especially young children, especially children with families, out of residential treatment, we would do whatever it took to do that. Both Gray and I had a background in working in residential treatment, and the folks that we have hired as clinicians in our group all have a connection with residential treatment, working in some capacity in those facilities. Lori, if you'll go to the next slide. What we discovered there is that when we were working in residential treatment, there was a uniqueness to the adoptive families' experiences for the kids that we were serving. We would see these amazing people who wanted very much for their children to be at home with them, but who simply could not keep everyone safe, bring their kids into residential treatment, exhausted, depleted, and feeling pretty hopeless and desperate when it comes to how do I keep my whole family safe. We've had experiences of people saying, you know, I think maybe our house has been caught on fire twice. I don't know what the outcome is going to be in the long run, but for now, if there's anything that you can do to help us, quote, fix our kid in order to live at home, end quote, would you do that? And what we experienced in that situation was that oftentimes these kids could be managed in residential treatment because of the structure that was in that kind of a setting, because of the boundaries that are just inherent in living inpatient, because of the level of staffing. You know, if you have a kid who's out of control, you staff that child one-on-one. Somebody else is making dinner. Somebody else is watching the other kids. Somebody else is doing laundry. And residential treatment just doesn't run the way that a family runs. You don't have locked doors as far as bathrooms and kitchens and I mean, it just is so structured based upon the level of the programming itself. And so those kids could be managed, not saying they didn't act out, but they could be managed within that structure. And what would happen would be that the folks that were working in residential treatment would begin to say, we can handle this kid. I wonder why their parents cannot do that. And the blame would get shifted onto the families as if it were the families creating the problem that brought the child into care. As if the family could just simply respond a little more therapeutically, or, you know, just add a few extra details in their home. Certainly this child would be able to be managed at home. And that was kind of the philosophy or the idea that people in residential would begin to get. The children would also be getting the message that it was really only professional staff that could manage their behavior, and they would begin to talk about how, you know, I am so-and-so and I'm diagnosed with bipolar disorder, or I'm diagnosed with, you know, reactive attachment disorder or whatever. And they would, I mean, I've had kids introduce themselves to me as, hi, I am so-and-so and I have such and such disorder. And that does not help, of course, at all with the way that the staff or the therapist could work with the family. And what would happen is that children and their parents would become triangulated even further, and we're talking about children who often had attachment strains and damaged relationships to start with. So we saw this across the board, the clinicians at LifeWorks, and so each one of us basically wanted to get out of residential treatment as well. If you'll go to the next slide. So we created this group, LifeWorks Family Treatment Group, and it had a family-centered approach, or a philosophy. Every clinician, every therapist in the group has the philosophy that we believe that spending an hour a week in a therapist's office is not going to change a child's life at all. But if we can help a family be consistent and long-term and supportive and give them the tools, then that will change a child's life. I've said over and over again to kids, you know, who are you going to call when you're 19 years old? It's 1 o'clock in the morning and you got a flat tire. You're not going to call your staff. You're not going to call your therapist. You're going to call your mom or your dad. And so the goal is not to create a therapeutic alliance between the child and the therapist, but rather between the child and the parents, and to give the parents and the families the strength that they need to be able to meet the needs of a child that's been impacted by trauma. And the other piece of philosophy that we have is that we understand that when a child comes into a family and they've been significantly impacted by trauma and have neurological issues related to through their early development, through genetics, a combination, whatever, that there's a ripple effect that occurs and that every member of that family then is impacted by the trauma that comes into the family. And so you have to work with the whole family unit, and it's not because you need to treat the parent so that the parent becomes a better parent to for this child, like there's something wrong with this parent, but instead that we need to strengthen the whole family unit, because without that support, the child is not going to be able to maintain the permanency in that home. And we also understand that that when it comes to permanency, we're talking about a person's lifespan. We're not talking about until they're 18. And so we really have to support this commitment between all the family members in order to maximize the benefit for families. Next slide. So when Lori called and said she wanted to bring her kids home and she wanted to take all of the components that we find in that kind of a structured setting and that kind of staffing and put her children at home and provide this within the family, it fit our philosophy perfectly. Next slide. So we jumped right on board, and since we began this piloted program in January of 2013, we've served 31 clients, 23 families. Of these clients, 3 were facing an adoption disruption at the time that they contacted us, and 21 were in residential treatment or some alternative out-of-home placement. So basically, we're not talking about kids that have been in residential and were graduating out of residential, but rather we had those kind of contacts where therapists were contacting us from residential treatment saying, I've got a kid in residential treatment who's 5 years old, they've been here 9 months, and they are not going to benefit from this. Their parent, their adoptive mom, wants them home. Can you provide services to get this kid home? And we immediately said, we'll do it. We'll do whatever it takes to do that. So bringing kids out of residential treatment was our biggest first initiative, and back into their homes. 4 of these children have been adopted from foster care due to the support of this kind of a program, due to this program. One little boy spent half of his life in a residential setting. He was 9 years old. He went to residential when he was 4 years old. He's been in 3 different residential settings, and that therapist from residential contacted us and said, I don't think this kid should grow up here, and that's what's happening. We've contacted one of his former foster families. Can you put one of those behavioral interventionists in his foster family? And if so, can we send him home and try to get him adopted and get him out of residential? We jumped right on board of that, of course. With that, I have to say 2 children have returned to residential treatment. But that's with the expectation that they're going to have a short stay. A lot of the kids that we're servicing have very intense medication regimes, and sometimes they can be managed for a while, but they have an issue with a certain medication that may have been working very well for them, and they wind up in the hospital needing a longer hospitalization stay than just a couple of days because their medication regime is is pretty complicated. So the idea is that they're doing a 30 to 90-day stint and will be returning back home with behavioral interventionist support. So that's really for a longer-term medication management situation. Next slide, please. So Lori and some of her staff at MFCAA contacted us last December and said, we think that you're having great success with this program, and as good social services would do when you have a program that's successful, you need to replicate it to see if it can have the same kind of impact. That's what good research would teach us, of course, from our classes. So in March of 2015, MFCAA, a separate agency, but one we work side by side with in this community, started the same program, replicating the services. And in this time, they've served 22 clients and 17 families just this year. Of these 22 clients, 4 of them were facing adoption disruption, and 7 are or had been in residential treatment. They currently are transitioning a set of 3 siblings from residential treatment into the paternal grandmother's home with the behavioral interventionist program. 4 of these children that have been selected into an adoptive home are willing to be adopted if the behavioral interventionist program gets added to their subsidy. 2 of those clients are transitioning from a residential treatment facility as we speak. They've had 1 successful adoption due to this program. This is all within the last year. We're talking about in the last 7 to 8 months. They also have had 1 client return to residential treatment, again, expecting that to be a short stay to regulate medication. So as you can see, we're seeing similar results in this replicated program side by side in this city. They are getting an average of about 2 referrals a week. We're getting an average of a referral a week. And so the need is great, as you can see. Next slide. With that, talking about the referrals that we are getting, those referrals are coming from therapists. They're coming from residential treatment facilities, child welfare workers, adoptive families, and what we're seeing is that the word of mouth about this program is spreading like wildfire. We had a question about a week or 2 ago, do you take every referral you get? And the answer is, of course not. We would have to assess and diagnose or do some diagnostic work to see if they meet the criteria for the program. In order to meet the criteria for the program, basically the child would meet the same level of criteria for residential treatment. So if they would meet the criteria in the state of Missouri for residential treatment, that would be the same criteria for this program. There are lesser restrictive kinds of services that could be offered for a lesser intense need. Funding sources may come from self-pay, through adoption subsidy, through children's treatment services dollars, mental health levy, and it can also be through, like contract agencies that may be offering those same services that the state would offer through children's treatment services dollars. A behavioral interventionist basically is matched with a family, and what we require is that a behavioral interventionist would have a bachelor's degree in a human service field, a couple of years of experience working directly with the population. Most of our behavioral interventionists are maybe graduate students, somewhere in their 20s and 30s, and most of them have had experience working in residential treatment facilities or similar programs. There's always some different kinds of situations. We've got a couple of behavioral interventionists that were special education teachers, and for whatever reason they are willing to spend some time as a behavioral interventionist part-time with us. So every shift, when a behavioral interventionist is matched with a family and they go work a shift in this home, every shift includes neurostimulation activities. And these activities are documented on their shift log on a daily basis. And they will coincide with what the child's treatment plan would have. So the therapist in the home would write the child's treatment plan, and incorporated into the child's treatment plan would be objectives that would include neural stimulation and neural activities. And of course, the persons responsible would be maybe the parent, the child, and the behavioral interventionist written into the plan. So all of that is documented. Critical incidents are documented. We provide supervision and consultation to the behavioral interventionists biweekly or weekly based on the situation. There's meeting with the families regularly. The therapist is coordinating that treatment. There's a supervisor in the program that may also be working directly with the behavioral interventionists and the parents as well. And every 3 to 6 months, based upon the level of need of the child or the family, we reevaluate, we do pre and post tests, we look for progress that's made, and we use standard tools to measure the child's functioning to do that. I've mentioned, go ahead to the next slide, please, Lori. I've mentioned the neurodevelopmental activities, and Lori talked about this as well. And basically what this looks like is activities that are targeting the part of the brain that needs the most work. It's the part of the brain that's developing in the first 2 to 3 years of life, where many times much of the trauma has occurred while this part of the brain is developing. And so anything that's got music or movement, repetition, touch, anxiety reduction. So it could look like maybe doing some hand jives. It could look like jumping on a trampoline. It could look like playing catch. Anything that's crossing the midline of the body, where you're engaging the brain and physical activity. So when you take a positive emotional experience and you couple it with a positive sensory experience, you get a good neural developmental activity. And that is based on the most recent work that's being published by folks like Bruce Perry and Dan Siegel. And we're seeing that kids who have this kind of brain input, kids who get that kind of regulation, can then learn to regulate emotionally and affectively with their caregiver and with their parents. And when they're able to be more regulated on a consistent basis, the neural pathways of the brain strengthen, that forms a chordal mapping that says the world's a safe place, my family's a safe place, my parents really do care for me, rather than the original chordal mapping that sets a template that says I don't trust families or adults or anyone that's going to take care of me but me. And that makes them able to think better. Kids who feel better think better and make better choices. With that, I want to turn over to Tim Decker, the Director of Children's Division.
Thank you, Susan. It's truly an honor to join this webinar. I've been the Child Welfare Director in Missouri for about 22 months now, and prior to that, I was the Director of our Division of Youth Services, so I think I bring a unique perspective to this. When I was at Youth Services, we set up a state policy team to work on something called crossover youth, which was basically trying to prevent children in the child welfare system from becoming involved in delinquency, and took a lot of interest in what happened that would cause a child's trauma to become their trajectory in life, and what it took to kind of interrupt that. So when I moved over and spent a lot of time with our State Youth Advisory Board, I became really initially intrigued with the BI program, as Lori Ross talked with me about it, and now I've become very inspired by what I see happening with children and young people through this program. When I was at Youth Services, we won the Harvard Innovations in American Government Award because of our therapeutic approach, and we actually tried in a juvenile justice setting to create therapeutic programs, family-based type programs within residential care, small groups, et cetera. And we were able to make some great progress and garner a lot of attention in terms of folks wanting to replicate the approach. But what I was really impressed with about this program is that the behavior interventionist is able to achieve some of the same things within the home environment, because we were still removing children from their homes. They were still in out-of-home placement. We just had a better out-of-home placement experience. So this was really movement from that approach to something that could be replicated in homes in more natural settings for young people. If we could go to the next slide, I want to share with you guys a bit about what I have seen as the benefits of this program, and then also want to get into a little bit later about what I believe makes it effective, because I think if you're going to replicate it or try to create it, it's important to understand the underlying infrastructure and what really makes it work or not work. And I think you've gotten a lot of it already from Lori and Susan. But why I really like this program is, for one, it promotes permanency, safety, and well-being as interconnected and interdependent goals. Now, let me say what I mean by that. Is that often, you heard Lori talk a lot and Susan talk a lot about really wanting to keep the child safe and their family safe. And often what that meant was safety meant removing the child from the home. So in a sense, we're compromising their long-term permanency. And when you hear the story of Cheyenne, you can hear how her long-term well-being was being compromised by the intervention that was available to address the safety issue, residential care. And this allows all of those goals to proceed in a really interconnected fashion. It also increases placement stability because it really reverses what we normally do. If you think about it, when a child begins to have trouble in a home, our workers right away start working on a new placement. And we don't shift as rapidly as we need to into thinking, how can we move the resources into the home so that we can maintain that stability for the child? We tend to move the child versus move the resources. And if you think about it, that doesn't really make very much sense. The other thing is we've seen so many cases where we've had disrupted adoptions, or worse yet, the appearance that a child has been adopted and has permanency when really they're living out their young adult years in residential care. Or we have kinship placements we don't consider because we don't feel like we can manage the child's behavior. So we might move to options like therapeutic foster care and things like that. And you begin to rethink this. And Lori shared an example with me the other day that really helped me think in a sharper way about this. If we can place the child with their grandmother, for instance, and provide a behavior interventionist, isn't that much better than, say, therapeutic foster care, which is a better option than residential care, obviously, least restrictive, but you're still moving kids to homes they're unfamiliar with and homes that eventually they will move from as they progress, versus them being able to progress in a home environment where they'll be able to stay and experience that long-term permanency and well-being. I think the other thing is about trauma. We've talked a lot about trauma on this call, and one of the things I've realized from talking to our young people a lot is it's not just like, I had a young person in our advisory board meeting a couple of weeks ago say to me, when I came into foster care, I felt like it was my fault, and almost everything that's happened since then has just reinforced that. And when I asked her more about what that stuff was, it was about her trauma being removed from her home and then how we re-traumatized her. So as an example, when you live your life where you go around waiting for the other shoe to drop because you know that if you get in some sort of trouble or misbehave or do something in the home that you're in or the placement you're in, you might very well get moved. The kind of stuff that I wouldn't have dreamed of my child moving from my home because he was having experiences, you'd get moved because the perception would be that the resources weren't there to work with you. And that could be very normalized developmental stuff that kids do. If you're in residential care and you do something, sometimes something very basic, the danger is you get kept there longer. And the reasons you get kept there is often due to just trying to do normal childlike things, or just the fact that we all make mistakes. We make mistakes, we come back from, we go back to our life. For a kid in residential care, that becomes a reason to extend their time there, and they feel like they're caught. So they get re-traumatized and feel this real lack of control. I think we also need to think about healthy brain development, because young people need normalized developmental opportunities. There's a great book called Age of Opportunity by Lawrence Steinberg, and Lawrence argues that the adolescent years are really as significant in brain development as the early childhood years. We talk a lot about the years of 0 to 3 and about how motor function and language and all that rapid growth and the connections being made in the brain, but a similar thing is happening in adolescence around what we call executive function, which is the ability to problem solve, to think long term, to regulate emotions, to be in relationships, to do long-term planning, to associate effort with outcomes or to associate behaviors with consequences. That's all being formed at those ages, and a lot of the research, the international research around residential care, is it's the one intervention that can in doing MRIs for kids in residential care shows delayed or interrupted brain development. Children in foster homes where there's caring adults and their stable placements can experience normal adolescent brain development, relative kinship placements, reuniting with families. But the one service, residential care, is the one that seems to impair adolescent brain development. The other thing is if we're going to make progress, you have to be asking yourself, does this make progress long term? And I think we'll hear more about Cheyenne later, which is going to be great. Is that this program really does build capacity and skills for both the child and family by teaching and reinforcing actual skills, not just awareness, but actual skills and practices in areas like self-regulation and communication, emotional connections and support, conflict resolution, all of those things that we know young people are going to need, as they grow older. They're going to help them to become healthy adults. So it's really key in terms of the changes that can occur. It's not just about managing kids, it's really about change and impact on their lives and getting them to a more normal developmental trajectory. Let's go on to the next slide. So when we talk about what makes it work, I'm convinced, and I know Lori and her organization really well. I know Susan less well, but I know if she's hanging out with Lori, then they share values, and I heard some of that expressed here. There's this combination of strong values and principles with some evidence-informed and field-tested practice. So you heard a lot about science and really thoughtfulness about what actually works and some pretty advanced thought about that. But it's also the values. You've got to have people doing this that really value keeping children in home placements, that really value supporting families, that really are willing, like Lori talked about earlier, to do whatever it takes to make it work, and to use that constant lens of what would we want for our own children, and if it's good for children and families, we're going to do it no matter what it takes. That's not always comfortable for everybody who interfaces and policymakers and all that, but that's absolutely the value space that we need our workforce coming from and that we need our partners coming from. So it's really the energy that then moves us to do the right thing. We have to balance trade-offs for kids, that they shouldn't have to compromise long-term well-being to address their trauma or to learn essential skills or to learn how to self-regulate. And they need those normalized experiences. And if this program actually provides those opportunities, you can create a basketball team or whatever in residential care. It's not going to be the same as being part of something in a community environment. It's not going to provide the same opportunities for kids. It's still going to have that whole residential lens and feel and institutional control. We know that relationships matter more than programs, and this really emphasizes those relationships. It's hard when you're worrying about safety to really then have the kind of connection with your child that you like to have, but when you can begin to get the safety, the physical and emotional safety in your home, you can really have a thriving, nurturing relationship, and I think it does that. And it really is very much a trauma-informed approach. So let's move on. I want to share a couple of visuals about how this plays out. So, we youth services where we have people visiting all the time, we always said to them that if you really want to change your systems, if you want to change your destination, you often have to start from a different place. And that involves re-examining your core values and your operating principles and combining that with evidence-informed and field-tested practices. And that's how you get outcomes. So you look for approaches that are both values-based and based on solid principles, but then also have proven practices. And this program really does that. This was really the formula for success. And here's when we get to the technical details about what works around behavior. I want to go to this next slide because it's a way we've often talked about it in some of our work. Let me cover values first. These are adapted actually from some of our youth service values, but we look for people who can really buy into beliefs like that people desire to do well and succeed. And remember that even the most resistant and challenging youth hunger for approval and acceptance, that we're really more alike than different, and we really, no matter what's going on, connection, understanding, and what I would call unrelenting compassion, no matter, and I think you heard that from Lori, you heard that from Susan, you'd hear that from parents involved in this, that, regardless of what's going on, we've got to understand the behavior in context, and we've got to have a compassionate approach to it. We've got to keep the love in this and the support in this. And that behavior is often a way that kids have learned how to meet their needs. It's a way they've learned how to manage their trauma. It's a way they've learned how to navigate their emotional pain. And we've got to understand that it probably has served some sort of function, and how can we address that through other strategies. And then often it's about increasing resources, both for parents as well as for the child. Due to their childhood trauma and their experiences, they're doing the best they can. And that really, ultimately, if we're really going to have healing and really going to have healthy development, it's going to be about families, and it's going to be about supporting that healing and that growth and development within family environments. So let's talk about behavior and how it changes for just a minute on the next slide. I keep preempting myself. So we know that, and this is a framework we've adopted in children's vision around 5 domains of well-being. We know that you can't really address one aspect, one part of a child, one frame of a person's life without affecting the others. So we might often intervene around behavior for a safety reason, but if that means that we upset the stability for that child, that they're bouncing from placement to placement, or we're upsetting their social connections. Lori talked about Cheyenne being 3 hours from home, and a lot of residential programs don't really have a way to really engage families as partners. You've now placed that child in an environment around their safety, disrupted their stability, disrupted their social connections, and they probably, if they develop mastery, which is around really that ability to experience success, we call them high five moments, it's often been in a residential context where they might have actually just learned routines in that program and learned how, basically, when you think about how staff might talk about, we can manage them here. Do we really want to manage our kids, or do we want to develop our kids? So it's a way to think about, can we bring then meaningful resources to families in ways that really work? Now let's go to the behavior slide as the next one. So here's what often happens. We call it the negative control loop. So you have programs that often are really focused on, if you're in a residential program often, the very best ones go a little beyond this, but you're focused on the routines, you're focused on conformity and submission. You basically want the kid to learn how to live in that environment, and that's what staff seek. The biggest fear of staff in residential care is losing control. Often, whether we like it or not, there's an embedded, organized way of punitive approaches. It can be point systems, it can be behavior mod programs, it can be use of separation in terms of room confinement. It can be, I was in one program that had something called 60-60. If you get in trouble, you're going to have to spend 60 minutes in your room and then 60 minutes with the group, 60 minutes back in your room. Think about how shaming that is for a child. At the best programs often get into behavior and cognitive approaches, thought processes, but there's no way they're able to really provide the connection and family and community support that's really needed. As we increase the more of that integrated approach, more of that family-based approach, there's really internalized change that's happening. When we don't, we get in something called the negative control loop, which is our intervention actually causes more stress and anxiety. It's not very well informed by science. It's not supported by emotional support and connection. Kids tend to then, they might conform for a while, but it'll build and they'll start to act up even again because they haven't really been taught, self-management skills, and you haven't really dealt with the underlying trauma. So then the behavior becomes a reason to do more of what's not working, and you're caught in that cycle. So we would have kids come and visit our programs in juvenile justice and say, we couldn't do this with our kids. They misbehave too much. And they've really been caught in that loop of your approach has created certain behavior, which then justifies your approach, and none of it works. So you're caught in this endless cycle of punishment and control and misbehavior. If we're going to break that cycle, we've got to deal with trauma. Let's go to the next slide. So, Brian Samuels, the former ACF director, would say that the research is very clear that that abuse and neglect places a traumatic fingerprint on the development of child, and it just cannot be ignored. And we really have to think about the developmental trajectories of maltreated children and what we're going to do about that. So if we go to the next slide, that really means understanding traumatic stress in children. So we know that, as I talked earlier, that early childhood and adolescence are critical periods of brain development. The brain science shows us that repeated exposure to trauma causes fight, flight, or freeze responses in children. I worked with a child in some of our youth ministry work that when he would get stressed, he would just freeze. And people thought that he was being resistant, that he was being obnoxious, that he was not responding to questions, and then they would come in with more and more. They would see him as a behavior problem and try to crack down on him and deal with his behavior. And it was very clear he was just freezing. When he would get stressed from his early trauma, he would just freeze, and he couldn't move from that spot. So that's a child that needed really concrete skills and really ways to develop different types of habits about how to handle stress and how to deal with his triggers around trauma. We also know that children that are exposed to trauma have to spend a great deal of time managing either the experiences from that traumatic event, that waiting for the other shoe to drop, that those are the feelings that they're having, or just really coping with the symptoms that have come from that, the things that have come into their life. And that really disrupts their energy they can put toward normal development and activities, the normal developmental stuff that we would want a child to experience. And the longer that goes on, the farther they stray from those appropriate developmental pathways. And really at that point, they're at risk for future trauma. They're less resilient. In fact, their pattern becomes to not be resilient versus to be resilient, which we all know we need in life. And there's real evidence that it leads to really negative social and health outcomes as adults. Many of you are familiar with the ACE study that found very profound health impacts from early childhood trauma and exposure. So we know that. Now, I share these core principles of trauma-informed care because we need to ask ourselves, and as you're talking to your leaders, ask them what approach better adheres to these principles. Is it residential care? Is it disrupted placements? Is it the continual applying approaches that don't work? Or is it going to be something like a BI program? So what's going to ensure more physical and emotional safety? What's going to begin to provide appropriate boundaries and work with children on navigating developmental tasks and begin to establish some boundaries that children can actually learn from and actually where families can develop and children can actually have a developmental experience. And what about appropriate control and choice? How much choice do you really have? If you have to go around always worrying about your behavior leading to cascading problems, that there's something you're going to do, a mistake you're going to make that's going to lead to placement change or loss of family visits or all of the things that children might experience, which one really gets the power back in the hands of children, family, and adults, and which really builds skills in the long term? You know, empowerment is not just about choice, because that's already covered here. It's also about really equipping people. That's really how empowerment is used in this situation. So I really want to speak to you a minute about, I know there's folks on the call that would want to say, how can I get one of these started? So if we go to the next slide, I want to share a little bit of information about that. I think the first thing that's so essential that I can't go on without covering is that you really do need champions for this change. You know, without Lori Ross, this program would have never been created. Without Susan Peach stepping up, this program would have never advanced to the point that it has. You need champions. Without a children's vision director who responded to Lori's request and was able to at least honor part of what she asked for, you know, Lori now is developing other champions, and so we can really expand this because our interest is in growing this program exponentially because we see it as such a positive alternative. You're going to need champions for that, and you're going to need people that are philosophically aligned and committed to this implementation. This is not something for the faint-hearted. This is not an easy change to make. It's not an easy path. It's really the path of most resistance in some ways. So you're going to need champions. You know, we thought about this even in expanding and saying, do we fund it in a way that makes it available so any willing provider can just step up and say, hey, I can do that? Well, everybody's not going to be like LifeWorks that has the combination of values and practices. Lots of people will say they can do this service or program, but you really need to drill down and see if they're committed to the same values as you are. Do they really believe, are they willing to really step up and wake up in the middle of the night if need be, if it takes that to keep a child in their home? Are they really willing to do really the hard work it takes to make that happen? Or are they really wanting more to provide services in an environment that's most comfortable for them or that maybe is most familiar? You need people who are willing to go outside the box and they're driven by their passion. If you don't have passion combined with practice, it's not going to work. But then you also need resources, right? So there's several that you might look at, and it'll vary a lot by state, but our Medicaid rehab plan is structured in a way that it's really designed to not only support some services in residential care, but also avoid residential placement. And individual states will vary on this, but we plan on using Medicaid rehab as one source of expanding this program. The Social Services Block Grant supports a whole host of programs that can really focus on self-sufficiency, reduce or eliminate dependency on services. It's a pretty flexible funding source that could be used. Title IV-B has two different sections. One is really directed toward keeping families together. You know, we talk often about families that have been adopted here, but this could also be used as a way of keeping families together or reuniting families where that's going to be necessary. But then also ensuring permanency. There's a second section, part 2, which is really focused more on adoption and permanency and reuniting families. So there's two sections of that. It's not a huge part of the Title IV program, but it's a significant one. Adoption incentives is another one. Those monies could be redirected toward more of what works, which is a really good argument to make. Some states have Title IV waiver demonstration projects where they're working with more flexible, or they have other waiver options that they're trying to capitalize on. And then there's state revenue dollars. Our CTS funds are primarily state revenue dollars. Those are community treatment service dollars. Those are to pay for the types of services and supports that families are needing, so that they can reunite, that families are needing, you know, in order to meet their kind of safety and permanency and well-being goals. So those are fairly flexible funds. They get used for a lot of stuff, quite frankly, that doesn't work very well, that has no evidence of success. So this was a great investment of some of our CTS dollars, but those are typically general revenue dollars. They might be leveraged a little bit, but also don't miss local. I think Susan mentioned this. A lot of states, you have mental health levy funds. We have the option here in Missouri where a county can vote to have a children's tax levy for mental health services. Those are great dollars that can be invested, or different mental health funds or private funds that can demonstrate the effectiveness of this approach so your state leaders could then grow it. So there's lots of ways to fund it. There's lots of reasons for people to like this and want to invest in it as an innovation in your state. So don't miss those opportunities that can then also later leverage some of the state and federal dollars or broader local dollars that might be necessary to take this to scale. We wouldn't probably be talking about taking this to scale if Lori and Susan and others hadn't proved that this could work. So that's always a good way to get it started. There's lots of other options. You have my contact information. If people want to discuss these, I can even connect you to our fiscal person to share more details about these different funding options. So with that, I'll turn it back over.
Okay, so this is Lori again, and I just wanted to update you on Cheyenne as a close. She's 13 years old now. She's an 8th grader at a treatment school. She still needs BI assistance every day because, you know, mental health is mental health, but she has decreased her self-injurious behaviors to almost none. She has decreased physical aggression against people to almost none. She has decreased physical aggression to property fairly significantly. We have an incident every once in a while, but hardly at all. She decreased cursing to almost none and name-calling very significantly. So she might call somebody a stealer or a liar, but she's not cussing them out. She has decreased stealing and lying herself very significantly. She still tantrums, but now we see maybe one a week rather than several a day. She can have interactions with her siblings without fighting for short periods of time, and even participate in activities which are fun and enjoyable for short periods of time without fighting. She has decreased her psychotropic medication slightly, with our hope being to decrease it even more over time. Today, her biggest issues are instigating and minding other people's business. She's still seeking attention constantly, and she can be very disrespectful in communication, which I know everyone will say is a 13-year-old thing, and it is, but Cheyenne is like disrespectful on steroids. She also has regular daily challenges, which can occasionally set off tantrums. But on the other hand, she can express sympathy and empathy for people. She can talk about how she feels. She can sometimes identify her own thinking and behavioral errors and accept responsibility for her behaviors. She's still working every day on how to learn to regulate her own emotions when she's upset. She practices by mirroring the emotions of myself or my husband or the BIs working with her, and practicing the tools she's learning in therapy and in processing the situations when she has calmed down. This is Cheyenne today, not too long ago. On the left, she had long hair, which she agreed to let us cut and send to one of the children's cancer wig programs. She thought about it for a while, wanted to do it. When it came time to sit down and do it, she had second thoughts, so she was nervous and anxious, and we talked through it. And then when she did it, you can see that smile on her face. She was pretty excited that she had done it and felt really good about it. And she put it in the envelope. She wrapped it all up like that, put it in the envelope, and mailed it herself. That's Cheyenne learning a little bit about self-esteem in the way that you learn about self-esteem, by doing something you're proud of. And on the right, that's a picture from not too long ago of Cheyenne and some of her siblings with one of our BIs when we were all bowling on a Saturday afternoon little family outing, something that I never would have dreamed several years ago that would be possible with Cheyenne or either of the other children sitting there at the table with her. So with that, I think we're at that question place. Kim, do you have any questions for us?
I have two really good questions. A couple of them that had come in, you guys answered throughout your presentation, which I figured would happen. But one is, what kind of training do the behavioral interventionists have, the level of training, and are they also therapists?
I'd like to address that. This is Susan. And the level of training, we mentioned the basics as far as we want them to have a bachelor's degree in the human service field and experience. But then we also do trauma-informed training. We use Bruce Perry's neurosequential model and train around that. We also train in-house on trauma-informed care. And we also are doing MANT training. We keep everyone's MANT training, which is a crisis de-escalation and response system that is commonly used in our area in Missouri. There's other ones. There's CPI. There's Safe Physical Management. And we've looked into those. We've chosen the MANT because that's what's widely accepted in the residential programs in our area.
Thank you, Susan. Another important question is, what's the age range of the children that are being served? And in particular, this individual would like to know about how many teens and older youth are involved, and if the approach is different for the older children than for the younger.
Can I address that as well? I can say that we have one client at Midwest Foster Care that is 3 years old, and that is our youngest client. That is not typical. At LifeWorks, we have a couple of 5-year-olds. That's pretty young as well. The majority of the clients that are being served are between the ages of 9 and 15. We've had a couple of kids that are older. The older they are, the more difficult they can be to work with, simply because of the whole legal piece that is involved. And our target audience has really been younger kids as far as getting them out of residential treatment at this point in time.
Susan, when you talk about legal piece, are you talking about kids that are dually involved?
Actually, I'm talking about the fact that, you know, when you have a 16 or 17-year-old client, if they choose to leave, they can legally do so in the state of Missouri at the age of 17.
Okay. All right. Thank you for clarifying that. And another question, very good question, is about how many hours a week are the BIs typically in the home?
This also varies. It could be up to, in some cases, in extreme cases, 60 hours a week. Most of the time, it's more around 20 to 30. In the summertime, this is going to increase. Basically, it's going to be the waking hours from the time that they get home from school, and most of the clients that we served are in either day treatment school settings, private day treatment school settings that the school district may either have in-house or contract out through, or they have IEPs where they're in specialized classrooms for services. So some of those classrooms those kids may get out of school at 2 o'clock in the afternoon until bedtime. Sometimes that's a 4 o'clock time. And so it really varies based on the school schedule. As you can imagine, during holiday break times and summer times, the hours are increased, and then we decrease those hours when they're not needed. Of course, when you have a child who's been suspended for 10 days, someone has to step up, because that's one of the things that gets kids into residential treatment. When you have parents who are facing job loss because of having to miss so much work with their child's behaviors and the rest of the community's inability to maintain them in other settings. we increase those hours during those times too.
Thanks, Susan. I think this one might be yours too. Under the current structure, are your services being provided as mental health services or blended, perhaps behavioral and mental health, or even occupational therapy, some physical health? Seems like a good model for coordinated care.
Absolutely, and let me also add to that part of the question asked was are the behavioral interventionist therapists? And I would say this is a blended model, that the behavioral interventionists in themselves are not licensed clinicians, although they may be. We have a couple that are on staff that do some hours as a behavioral interventionist because they're committed to the program and can do so. But there is a therapist, a licensed clinical therapist, whether that be whatever the licensing be for their field, that is managing the care, that's providing the family therapy and writing the treatment goals and objectives and measuring the outcomes. And then the behavioral interventionists are then in-house or in the home and may participate in the family therapy for part of the time, for all of the time. They may provide the input to the therapist and the parents. They participate in the treatment reviews as a team with the parent, the therapist, and the behavioral interventionist, and then their supervisor.
Lori, somebody would like to know how long it took for Cheyenne to reach her current behavioral success.
The primary changes, the big decrease in the acting out behavior and the self-injurious behavior, I'd say that all happened within maybe the first 6 months. She wasn't sure that we meant it when we said she was never going to not live at home again. So it took a little bit of time for her to trust that. And it also took a little bit of time for us to work with LifeWorks to get, some real stability around who the behavioral interventionists were that were working in our home and how they worked most effectively with my kids, because it is kind of a mix, match, and fit thing for each individual family and the functioning of the family and the needs of the kid. But much of her behavior change happened very quickly, which then allowed us to begin now the harder part, which is really doing the healing work, helping her get to the point where she can tell her story, where she can recognize where her traumas were, and where she can begin to develop the ability to recognize when she needs to use a skill rather than just immediately going to fight, flight, or freeze. So we're working on the hard stuff now. We got the real exploding stuff under control pretty quickly, and now we're working on the deeper work.
Great. And then another question, what type of training, tools, specialized education, and or coaching do the parents get through the program?
So Susan, do you want to do that? Or
the parents are involved. Well, I would like to just say that the parents are involved throughout the entire process in family therapy, so they get individualized work with their family therapist, as well as the fact that many of the families that we serve and the parents that we serve have been trained through the foster care system and the foster adoptive system. Lori, you may want to take it from there as far as that training.
Yeah, so basically this intervention is really focused a whole lot on the treatment of the child. So what we see is that the parent is working, it's kind of a nice team in that the parent is aligned with a therapist who understands at the core the need and the value of the family to the child's healing. So the parent is involved in every aspect. What the parents get is kind of just by watching. Parents who have less skills in terms of understanding that children's behavior is not really about them, and that and how to help that child regulate, learn by watching as the BIs de-escalate the child what is most effective in working with their child. But the majority of the situations are not really about teaching the parent, although the parent and the BI together figure out what works best with their child. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does make sense. Thank you.
Okay.
I don't see any more. I do see the person who asked the question said, yes, thanks, exclamation. I don't see more questions. I see some thanks. I can also let you know that people have stayed with us. We really appreciate all of you folks that stayed with us for this longer than usual webinar. If you could hear everybody, you'd probably hear clapping. Susan, Lori, Tim, thank you so much. And as I said in the beginning, all three of our presenters are open to continued questions from you. We will also be posting this on our website at www.advocatesforfamiliesfirst.org. Probably be next week by the time it gets up there. And really thank you to both our presenters and our participants. And with that, I will wish you a good day.
Thank you.